So our mind, just instinctively thinks, I want freedom means this one, and only this one. But when you think about it, everybody wants happiness, wants freedom, wants to avoid suffering equally. We're not any more or any less important than anybody else. So that really challenges us to open the scope of our mind to really say, may all beings have happiness and its causes, and may all beings be free of suffering and its causes. But, and it feels, we train our mind in metta and karuna, and that feels very good. But sometimes, when it comes to the practical applications, we get a little confused. Yeah. Because we say, may all sentient beings have happiness and its causes. And there's somebody with a substance abuse problem who wants drugs or alcohol, and that's their happiness and the cause of their happiness. So then we say, well, does that mean I support their drug alcohol problem? Yeah. Or you might look at Osama bin Laden or, whoever, rattles you. The Republicans just chose Paul Ryan as the vice presidential candidate. He's about as right-wing as you can possibly get. And you say, well, may they have happiness in its causes. So does that mean that you want Osama bin Laden's, endeavors to succeed, and you want Romney and Ryan to, take over the government, because that's what's going to make them happy? And what do you do when one person's happiness interferes with another person's happiness? Yeah, two people are having a property dispute, and you say this one really wants to win have the property, so may they have it. But then somebody else is going to be very unhappy by not having it. So when we really come to employ the meaning of, love and compassion, sometimes we get a little bit confused. And it very easily falls back to, may everybody I like have happiness and be free of suffering, And but that's not what we're getting at, okay? So this is really something to think about in our practice. I'm posing the question so that you'll think about it. We can discuss it together later on, but, to really look at it in your life. And what does it, aside from in meditation, wanting, developing love, loving kindness and compassion, what does it mean in real life, dealing with people? Yeah, because our spiritual practice has to be related to our real life. Otherwise, what's the use? Actually, I shouldn't say real life. I should say falsely appearing real life. Okay, so just something for you to, think about, and maybe you can discuss it while pulling knapweed. Yeah. Okay, so we left off yesterday with the Buddha's enlightenment after battling his anger and attachment and ignorance. Yeah, so he became fully enlightened. And then once you become fully enlightened, then what do you do? Now, And I say this because sometimes in our life we're very, very goal-oriented. I want this. But we don't think, what are we going to do the day after we get that? Yeah? Which is an interesting question, no matter what it is. I want to get this job. Then you get it. Then what do you do the day after you get it? It's like you've met your thing. Some people have what I call ordination fever. I want to get ordained. And then, what are you going to do the day after you get ordained? And, so it's quite interesting to really look at that, because otherwise we get fixated just on a goal like, I want to be enlightened, or I want this job, or I want to get married, or I want to get ordained. But what are you going to do after that? Okay? So that's, we find the Buddha after his enlightenment going, well, what am I going to do? Because nobody's going to understand what in the world I've understood. Yeah? If they thought I was crazy for becoming a monastic, they're going to think I'm even crazier for sharing my realizations with them. Nobody's going to understand. And so he really, as the story goes, he hesitated to teach. And it was only because the gods, Brahma and Saka and so on, came and requested him to teach and said, but there's some beings with little dust in their wisdom eye, so please teach, please teach. So there's something interesting in that story for me. Do you really think that a fully enlightened Buddha would say, what am I going to do now? And who's going to understand what I say? What I realize? Do you think that's really going to happen? Yeah? Do you think the Buddha's going to have this great realization and then go, what'd I do all this for? Because nobody's going to understand. Yeah, I don't think, really, a fully enlightened being is going to do that. So then, what's this story about? Yeah?
It's a tradition, for example, if somebody wants to enter a monastery, maybe in the Tibet tradition too, they prove them if they really want to, so they have to request not only once, maybe twice, 3 times, and have to wait in front of the monastery and really show their enthusiasm and their effort enter the monastery.
Okay, so you're saying that sometimes people, they may request ordination or membership in a monastery, but initially they're turned down, and it's a way to really test their earnestness. Yeah? And so perhaps the Buddha was testing the earnestness of sentient beings, whether they really wanted to learn. Yeah. Yeah, Terry?
Well, Buddhism would have been a new religion then, whereas Hinduism was well established. Having the gods of Hinduism go to Buddha and say, hey, you got to teach what you know so everybody can learn. That's a powerful incentive for those Hindus to start practicing Buddhism.
Right. By having the gods in the, it wasn't really so much Hinduism, it was Veda, Brahma, the Brahminical tradition, but it was the same gods. But having them, who were very well established, who people respected, go and ask the Buddha for teachings, really was a very powerful statement of the Buddha's enlightenment and, their faith in him to be able to lead beings out of suffering. So I think, regardless of whether the story is true or not, it's a way of including the broader culture in India at that time in supporting, what the Buddha was doing. okay, and approving of the Buddha. And you look at Buddhism coming to the West, and we kind of say, well, what in our culture, is going to be like asking the Buddha to teach, or validating the usefulness of the Buddha's teachings in our culture? Okay, so a few different things. One is celebrities, because people very blindly follow celebrities. And another is science, and so scientific validation of what the Buddha has been saying for years. Or the whole thing of, like mindfulness training for stress reduction, for pain reduction, and so on. It's a way of, showing the validity of what the Buddha taught. There's also in our culture a little bit of a danger, and there probably was at the time of the Buddha too, by incorporating the things from the larger culture. Because then how much you're going to get involved with the other viewpoints of that larger culture. Okay? And it was interesting because the Buddha seemed to get along quite well with different Brahmins. He would discuss with them and question and debate with them. But the ones that he really, debated with were some of the other ascetic groups of that time. And said that, really questioned their beliefs and their modes of conduct. Of course, he questioned the Brahminical way of thinking too, because he did away with the caste system, and he redefined the meaning of Brahman, instead of being a birth and a high caste, to meaning somebody who was an ethical, wise individual in society. So he completely, because people were coming to him and kind of saying, well, your disciples aren't all Brahmins. Some of them are from these lower castes. And he's saying, well, what does it really mean to be a Brahmin? It's not just your birth, it's your behavior, it's your way of thinking. But in our culture, it's, the challenges are a little bit different. And I think we're still in the process of figuring it out. How much is Buddhism and Buddhist leaders going to rely on science to introduce Buddhism to the broader culture? And what effect is this going to have on Buddhism? One of my monk friends in Tibet, in one of the monasteries in the south, I read something he wrote. He was suggesting that, because it's always been difficult with having Asian teachers come to the West, and, there's been difficulties with that. And he was suggesting that people's spiritual attainments get tested by science. And then if somebody can be certified as having realizations, then they can be sent to the West. I have some qualms about that one. I don't think you can really certify somebody's spiritual realizations by science. And I'm not sure I would want to give science that authority over Buddhism, considering how, really the scientists themselves are the first ones to say how little they know, even though Western society idolizes them. And, whatever science says from one year to the next, we believe. And when it changes its idea the next year, we never say, we thought science discovered this. Why are they saying the opposite now? We just, accept it. It's quite interesting, isn't it?
Especially with flip-flopping on the issues is such...
Yeah, really. When things really flip-flop on the issues, we just go right along with it. Yeah. One of the kinds of inferences is, inference by authority, authoritative testimony, where you rely on somebody who is an authority in that particular area. And in our culture, we rely on science as an authority, even though it changes its mind in the next year. Yeah? But the Buddha, who is an enlightened being, when he says things that are new to us and a little bit challenging to our worldview, we don't rely on the Buddha as an authoritative expert on that field. We say, what does this guy know? If science can prove it, then I'll believe it. It's quite interesting, isn't it? Yeah, for people who aren't Buddhist, you can really understand that. But for people who are Buddhist, in the West anyway, still and I'm not saying this is necessarily bad, because I think we really have to question things and investigate, and not just accept things on blind belief. But so often we are quite resistant to accepting certain statements in the teachings that disagree with our own opinions. Yeah, statements in the scriptures that agree with our own opinions. We don't question those or mess with those, but the ones that disagree. Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it, how sentient beings think? If we have an opinion and an authority supports our opinion, then we say, that authority's really wise, and they know, and see, that authority said this, so you should believe it too. But when the authority disagrees with our idea, then we say, that guy's biased, what does he know, this. And actually my idea's right. Yeah. So, the whole thing actually boils down to looking at why we accept certain people or things as authorities, and what are our criteria, and are our criteria reasonable criteria. Okay. So I'm not going to tell you the answer to that one either, but let you stew with it a bit. Yeah, make you think a bit. Okay, so anyway, that was going on at the time of the Buddha in the same way that these things are going on now. And, I just as I have, some concern about scientific involvement in Buddhism, in the sense that, first of all, of people looking to science to prove Buddhism, but also in the sense of people who are scientists or therapists extracting something from Buddhism and teaching it, which I think is very good and can be used to help the broader public. But then to say, I'm a Buddhist teacher, I think isn't quite right. Okay, to take a technique from the Buddhist, tradition and teach it broadly and secularize it, great, it benefits people. Yeah, but that doesn't make one a Buddhist teacher. You're still a therapist, or you're still a Catholic priest, or you're still whatever. Yeah, so one concern I have is that people, let's say they may learn mindfulness for stress reduction, and then they think that's all that Buddhism teaches. Which would be a really great loss, because Buddhism is a path for spiritual liberation. Yeah, and if people started thinking that it's only good for solving problems in this life, then, the tradition's not going to get carried on in the way that the Buddha taught it. It's going to get very diluted. So I think it's something to be attentive to and aware of. Yeah, I was rather shocked. I know I'm getting off target here, but I went to a Buddhist teachers conference a little bit over a year ago in Garrison, New York, and it was all about handing the, welcoming the new generation of teachers. And I think it's great that there's, young people who are up-and-coming Buddhist practitioners. But it seemed there, from the level of discussion, that the only criteria for being a Buddhist teacher in the new generation was first your age, and second that you could teach mindfulness meditation. And that seemed to be the only criteria. There was no discussion at all about the responsibilities of being a teacher and what it means and what you have to do inside yourself. What is a qualified teacher? It just seems like, well, if you teach mindfulness, then you're a Buddhist teacher. And the more tattoos you have, then the more the young people are going to be attracted to you, and your whole way of drawing in students is because you're young. Yeah, it was really like that, kind of like, well, the young teachers are young, so the young people can identify with the young teachers, and that's going to bring more Buddhists in, because we're really hip and we know the young youth culture and everything. And I was thinking, that's, to me, I don't remember seeing that as the list of qualities of a qualified Mahayana teacher in Maitreya's text, where he gave out all the qualities to look for in a teacher. That wasn't one of them. And I reflected on my teachers, and my teachers are all old, and I thought, there's a reason why. And I have really good teachers. I really hit the jackpot. But, why are the really good teachers old? Yeah. And this is a good question to ask in a culture like ours, where being young is being in and you're with it and you know more than anybody else. And the young people forgetting that they're going to be the older generation pretty soon. But I was thinking, it's interesting. My teachers are all so old. Why is that? Yeah. So I'll let you think about that one too. Okay, so then, Saka and Brahma and so forth did convince the Buddha to teach. So then he said, who am I going to teach? And then he thought of his first two teachers who had taught him, the form and formless absorptions. But they had both just died very recently, so they didn't have the karma to meet the Buddha after he was enlightened. And so then he thought about his 5 companions, the ones who had scorned him and ridiculed him for being a softy because he was leaving the ascetic practices and he was going to eat again. It's amazing how we get so rigid in our way of thinking, isn't it? It's like, he's eating, he can't be a spiritual practitioner if he eats. Really, a little bit narrow-minded, huh? It's another way, look at how our human minds work. Whatever we choose, we become a born-again whatever. Yeah, so they were born-again ascetics, and then you have born-again vegetarians, and you even meet some Buddhists who are fundamentalist Buddhists. My tradition is the right one, nobody else is the right. Yeah. So I've always thought that all the fundamentalists in the world should really get together. They have so much in common. in terms of their way of thinking. What they think is very different, but their whole way of thinking is, they'd all get along very well if they could agree on what they thought. But their way of thinking, they're all like peas in a pod. So he went, he saw with his clairvoyant powers that those 5 disciples were then at Sarnath, near Varanasi or Benares. And so he started walking there. And I think about this, like, how would you feel if there were people who were your trusted friends who you practiced the Dharma with, who then ridiculed you and swore at you because you went off because you knew what you were doing wasn't working and you were really seeking the truth? I mean, how do we respond to people who criticize us and call us names? Are they the first people we think of sharing the precious Dharma with? Or of contacting again after we've understood something very profound? Our mind is just like shut down regarding those people. I don't want to get near them, and they did this to me. No way I'm going there. And yet, look at the level of the Buddha's compassion that he saw. They were the ones who were the most receptive at that moment. And so he went there. And of course, as he was approaching, they all said to each other, "Oh, there's that slough-off, lazy bum, who's coming. So don't prepare him a seat. Don't give him any water. Don't treat him with any respect." And so as the Buddha was approaching, they just kind of said, "Hi, Siddhartha, how you doing? We haven't seen you for a long time." No kind of respect at all initially. But somehow the Buddha's energy, we've been having this discussion at the Abbey, what does vibe mean? What's a vibe? But the Buddha's vibe, really touched them, and they found themselves after a while treating him respectfully. And so that, I think, opened their minds to really hear what he had to say. Because if they hadn't had that change of mind, that change of heart, to see that there was something special about him, if they had maintained their disrespectful, casual attitude, then I don't think he would have taught, because their minds would not have been open and receptive. Yeah, it's the same way with us. When our minds are very proud or arrogant or not very respectful, then we're not really proper vessels. Yeah, and we're going to miss out on things because we either the teachers won't teach, or even if they do teach, we don't hear it. Okay, so so then he taught them, and he taught the Four Noble Truths. That was his first teaching. And within the Four Noble Truths, the first thing about the Four Noble Truths is impermanence. And so that was his first teaching about how everything in our world changes all the time without needing another cause to make it change. Just its coming into existence is sufficient for it to change. This is what we were talking about Thursday night when we were talking about the categories of phenomena and impermanent phenomena. So that was his first teaching. And interestingly, it was also his last teaching. Yeah, because when he passed away, what is that a teaching of? Impermanence, isn't it? Yeah. Especially, and that's even gross impermanence, the passing away of a person. So he showed that just by his very way of being. And I see with my teachers what happens as they age and approach death, and what happens to the different disciples as that happens. You know, people's different reactions to the death of a teacher, and it's really very telling. It's very telling. Before I tell stories about that, I just remember, what was his name? Pelden, the Tibetan monk who was in Chinese prison, Pelden Gyatso. And he, in his book, when he was telling about the time of being incarcerated, he was incarcerated for about 30 years. There was one Geshe who was incarcerated with him, and when the Chinese Communist guards went to torture that Geshe, you know, and here was a Geshe who had done all this profound study and learned all these scriptures and debated them and, you know, could tell you this, that, and the other thing about Buddhist philosophy. But when faced with getting tortured, he completely fell apart and was just pleading with the guides, please don't beat me, please don't hurt me, please don't kill me. You know, and Pelden Gyatso, who was not a Geshe, you know, related that story and said how it really made him think or see the difference between knowledge of the Dharma and experience of the Dharma. So it's not enough just to have a lot of knowledge. We have to be able to use it at times like that. And it's not to criticize the Geshe, because, you know, really employing the Dharma when your life is at stake can be difficult, because we so easily go back to our old ways of just being terrified, don't we? You know? Something happens and we're terrified. You know, forget impermanence, forget emptiness, forget compassion. We're just back to our old samsaric, knee-jerk emotional responses. So it also shows how hard it is to change the mind. But the fact that it is possible, because you had Pelden Gyatso going through the same thing and enduring it quite well. Yeah. It was quite amazing, because after he came, he was in Seattle, and we arranged from one day to the next for him to speak to DFF. Some of you were there. And the only time for him to speak was at 6 a.m. the next day. So he came and he gave a talk at 6 a.m. And then people left to go to work, and then we offered him breakfast. While we were preparing breakfast, there was, in the little cubby area where the kitchen table was, there was one picture of Chenrezig and one picture of His Holiness. And I can't remember which one that he was looked at, but whenever I was carrying the bread and different things in and out, he was just looking at that picture, you know. And I said, that's how he endured his experience in prison, you know. He had a rock solid inside here connection with His Holiness and with Chenrezig. And it was through that, you know, he made it through. It was really quite something just to watch him, like, completely look at that. Okay, so then the Buddha went to teach the 5 ascetics. And that's the way the Sangha community started, because they became his disciples. Yeah, and Sangha was a common Indian term that kind of meant the circle or assembly of disciples of a particular teacher. And, thus the Sangha began. And the Buddha spent the next 45 years going all over northern India teaching. And when you read the Pali Canon, you really get the sense of the Buddha as a human being and how he dealt with other people and the kind of situations he would encounter. And it wasn't like, everybody saw the Buddha and then did somersaults and fell at his feet and said, you're the enlightened one. There were people who tried to trick him and deceive him in debate. There were people who criticized him. There were his disciples who sometimes had incredibly wrong views, which they were propagating. There were disciples who were quarreling with each other. There were disciples who were behaving, kind of almost like you can't believe somebody could be a monastic and behave like that. When you read the Vinaya and you read the stories, it's like, oh my God. Yeah, but you really see how expansive his heart was, that he was able to include everybody in his heart, but he was also able to establish a structure and stick with that structure. Yeah, and tell people that behavior is not becoming for a monastic. That view is a wrong view. You're foolish. He said to people straight out, you're foolish. Yeah, you're not thinking clearly. So, you really got the sense, like, very compassionate, but also he could be very straightforward. He didn't, he wasn't, oh, poor you, little, kind of like we want sometimes, We want somebody to pat us on, oh, poor you, you're so sweet, you're such a good student. You don't see the Buddha doing that a lot. You see him being incredibly compassionate and kind to people. But he doesn't feed their defilements. And for those who can take it, he's very straightforward and says, you're not thinking in the correct way. And he says it in so many words. But it's very interesting how he does it, because first he calls somebody to him, and he says, I've heard that you're doing this, or I've heard that you're saying that. Is that true? So he always asks the other person first if what he's heard is true. And then if the person says yes, then he says, that's not the correct way to act, or the correct way to think, and he'll scold him. But he doesn't first call somebody to him and lay into that person. He always checks first about the information that he received. Yeah, and also checks first about the interpretation of that information. So again, I think that's quite important for us too, when we hear things about other people, to not just assume that what we're hearing is true, but to really ask that person themselves what they did, and also what they meant when they said a certain thing or did a certain thing. Okay, so what I'm getting at is just from the Buddha's life story, just how he related to other beings. There's a lot of teaching in that about how to behave, yeah, and how to work with other people. And like I said, he was often quite something with the other ascetics. He was. It's quite interesting. Of course, you have these very stereotype passages, but it seems that whenever that Nigrantha's, am I saying his name right? Nigrantha, the Jain leader. Anyway, when his disciples, the scriptures talk about his disciples, it's always like a completely chaotic situation with all of his disciples hanging around, screaming at the top of their voices, talking about worldly things, and then the Buddha approaches and they quiet down. Yeah, so there is some stereotype in there, yeah. But he always talked to those people, but he didn't mix with them in the sense of saying, oh, your views are right, and what you're saying is really what I'm saying, and, yeah, your discipline is fine, and, he drew quite distinctions between, even some of the matted hair ascetics who were, involved with their samadhi and their magical powers. He, drew distinctions between what he believed and taught and what they believed and taught. And yet he was always kind and respectful to those people. And even, when some of the people who were supporting the Buddhist Sangha, he didn't say, don't give your support to the other ascetics anymore. Yeah? He always said, yes, if you want to support them, go ahead. He didn't say, you can't support them anymore, I want all your dough. Yeah, so he wasn't possessive about his benefactors. That he was respectful of them and, the different choices and how they wished to distribute their offerings. So you just, have the Buddha wandering, in different places. And so the Sangha also wandered, except for the rainy season. Okay, in India you have rainy season, usually starts mid-June and goes through early September, and sometimes middle of September actually. And at those times, the Buddha always stayed, the Sangha always stayed stationary. And the way this came about, and the way all of the precepts for the Sangha came about, was at the beginning, there were no rules, there were no precepts, there was nothing. And it was only after people started misbehaving that then the Buddha said, that's not proper conduct, and made a precept about something. Or only after the lay people complained about what the Sangha was doing, then he made a precept, or sometimes it was a precept against certain behavior, sometimes it was a policy to do a certain behavior. Okay? So in the case of the Vasa or Varsa, one's Pali, one's Sanskrit pronunciation, the 3 months of the summer retreat, that came about because in the summer it rained and you had all these, India's just full of insects and everything comes out of everywhere. And then also that's when the crops were getting watered and beginning to grow. And so if they were wandering during that time, they would be destroying the farmers' crops and they would probably be stepping on a lot of insects. And so the other ascetics of that time didn't wander during the rainy season. They stayed put. And so the lay people started saying, well, why is your Sangha going here and going there and, completely not caring about where they walk and if it's people's crops and what they step on and so on. And so then the Buddha said, okay, then for the 3 months of the rainy season, then the Sangha's going to stay settled in one place. Okay, and so then you had that whole season of having the Vasa retreat. What's interesting during the retreat is because we so often think of retreat as, you go off alone and you stay alone and you don't talk to anybody. Okay? When they started doing the Vasa retreat, it was the one time where the Sangha all stayed together. So, they were really staying in community during that time. And at the beginning, some of the monks, the Buddha asked them, how did you spend the Vasa? And they said, well, the person who went into town first to collect alms, when he came back, he would put his alms out, he would lay the water out for everybody else, and what everybody else needed, he would eat, he would leave the leftover food for others, and then the next person who came would eat and clean up what he did, and the last person would clean up for everybody, but nobody talked to each other because we were all in silent retreat during this time. And the Buddha looked at that group of monks and said, "You fools, what are you keeping silence for? You should be discussing the Dharma." Yeah. I find this story very interesting because it's really against all of our notions of, going off and not talking to anybody. He said, you should be discussing the Dharma, not discussing the Olympics and the presidential election, but discuss the Dharma. Learn from each other. This is the time for you to learn from each other. Okay? So I thought that was quite an interesting story. So he really wanted people to be together and learn from each other. Yeah. Now, the remainder of the year, they were generally wandering. And I think that's because that was the accepted custom at that time, was for the wanderers to wander. Okay? But people started offering these parks and residences that then the Sangha used for their rainy season retreat. But then they were supposed to leave those after the rainy season retreat and continue wandering. But what happened over time is that the Sangha became more and more settled. And, after the Buddha passed away, then, at the end of the Varsa, many of the Sangha just stayed on. And so you had the development of different Sangha communities. Okay? Which makes sense because... And I'm sure some people kept on wandering and some people were more celibate. Not celibate, cenobite. Cenobite is the word. That there's different styles of practice, So for some, wandering all the time really helped them not attach to anything and to learn to be, more emotionally independent and, not all caught up in relationships and so on and so forth. But for other people, living in a community was the way that they really grew. Yeah? But even the people that wandered, they often would go in pairs, and you weren't allowed to wander on your own for the first 5 years. This is for the men after they ordained. Because you need to be near your teacher to learn how to behave properly. Okay. The women, on the other hand, weren't allowed to live in the forest and at the root of the tree and so on and so forth, because it was said that, they could be vulnerable to attack, principally by men, not so much the wild animals, but by human beings. Okay, so they were, lived in community and generally closer to a village, but again with a boundary around so that they didn't mix too much with the villagers. Okay, so you had this whole process of the precepts being made due to the behavior of the Sangha. So it was very much trial and error. Yeah, we see the Buddha as really, sculpting the Sangha depending upon the conditions and the situation and what happened. So it wasn't like he said, okay, now I'm starting a group called the Sangha. Here's the constitution. You got to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. He didn't lay it all out at the beginning and say, this is what you've got to do. It's, the first ordination ceremony was come, O bhikshu, or come, O bhikshuni, and that was it. But it was because of misbehavior that then the precepts, came about. But even when he established the precepts, you saw that they weren't hard and fast and concrete, because another situation would happen, and somebody would keep that precept exactly as the Buddha had laid it out. And then people would complain about that, because the situation was slightly different. And so then the Buddha would be consulted again, and he would say, well, yes, we keep the precept, but in this situation, you take these other factors into account, and you behave differently. Okay? So there, in certain areas, like for example, one of the Buddha's concerns was with the kind of seats that the Sangha had. Because often if people have very nice seats, they get arrogant. Okay? So in one area, a certain kind of material was, one material was very cheap and one material was very expensive. So in that area, the Sangha had to sit on seats made of the cheap material so that they didn't get all proud that, oh, look at me, I'm sitting on this really expensive, seat. But then, when the Sangha lived in another area, it was the reverse. And so then people were saying, well, they're sitting on that kind of padding. Who do they think they are? They aren't very humble wanderers sitting on that material. And so then the Buddha had to say, well, in this place, you don't sit on that material. You switch it around. You sit on the other one. Okay? So he was always trying to get people to think about the meaning behind the precepts. What is the mental state that each precept is aiming at? Okay? And so even now you have different ways. You can really see the different mentalities people have when they approach the Dharma and when they approach the Vinaya. And there's some people who approach it like, okay, here's the rule, this is what it says, this is what we do. That's it. And other people who approach it as, okay, here's the rule. What was the mental state the Buddha was trying to get at? And if we keep the rule literally in our present social situation, are we going to be encouraging the mental state the Buddha wanted or discouraging that mental state? Okay, and so then those people may reinterpret the meaning of a specific precept according to the difference in conditions that exist at the present time. Okay, so you'll see now, if you go to different Buddhist communities, that people keep the precepts in a different way because people have different mentalities and different ways of thinking. And for some people, this is what the Buddha said, this is what you do, that's it. And for other people, this is what the Buddha said, but what was he getting at? And let's shape how we keep the precepts in order to get at the meaning the Buddha was intended. Okay? So, you come up with these kinds of differences. And, as Buddhists spread through different countries in different places, the conditions were very, very different. Very different. In the initially, one of the precepts is that the Sangha doesn't dig the earth and we don't do agriculture. In China, in order to in general, in order to go on Pindapat, you had to be near a town or a city for people to make offerings. What happened in China is the Sangha found that when they lived near a town or a city, they would get involved in the politics of that place. And they would have to favor the leader and, support the leader so that the political leader would, be a benefactor of the Sangha and so on. And some of the Chinese Sangha said, this is not what we want to do, and this isn't according to, what the Buddha's intention was. So we want to go to the mountains and be far away from the city where we can just really practice without having to get drawn into all this politics. So they went out into the mountains. But when you're out in the mountains, there aren't many, you can't go on alms round. There aren't any people there. So they had to start growing their own food. Okay? So in that context, it makes sense, doesn't it? It makes sense for the Sangha to grow their own food, because it was either that or live in the cities and get involved in the politics. Okay? Now, if you grow your own food, there is the danger, if you dig the soil, of killing animals. But you also can try and be really careful, and dig as minimum as possible, or ask people who don't have the precepts to do the digging for you, so there's kind of ways around that. But, their way of thinking is, which is the worst, which is the best? Do we stay in the city and get involved in politics? Do we stay in the countryside and grow our own food? Okay, and in that situation, it makes complete sense. Stay in the countryside, grow your own food, and practice as you really want to. Okay, so you'll find these kinds of things happening. And of course, whichever way you choose, it's not perfect. Yeah. Whatever way you choose, there's always going to be somebody that says, yes, but, that's taking you beyond this, So somebody could easily say to the ones who are growing their food, well, but then you have to spend all that time growing your food, so you don't have that time to practice. Yeah, so might as well stay in the city. So there may be some people who see it that way, but then other people who say, well, no, I can grow the food and transform it into part of my Dharma practice. Yeah? So what I'm getting at is that people think in different ways and come to different conclusions. So let's have a very broad mind in looking at the topic of what the precepts are and how to keep them, and a broad mind in the different decisions that people are going to come up with as to how to keep different precepts. Okay? And if we choose to, shift the way we keep something, we should have reasons for it, besides, this is the way I want to do it. Or this is what's most comfortable for my ego. There should be some sound reason that accords with, what the Buddha would say for shifting how we do something. Okay, so we'll stop.